So our next speaker is Tony Henderson-Newport, and he's a wonderful guy. He's a serial entrepreneur and running multiple businesses. And one of the things that is so amazing is the pop-up business school that he's been running. He started and he's been running across New Zealand, helping business people start, or entrepreneurs start businesses. So thank you, Tony, for coming and talking with us today.
You're very welcome, Kathy. I've actually been really looking forward to this session for sure.
Oh, fantastic. So today we're going to be talking about an entrepreneur mindset and how we can build capability through that changed perspective. So when we're talking about mindset, what on earth is it? What are we talking about?
And so the interesting thing about mindset is that it's very much what we believe. And it's an underlying mechanism that every human has that can expose opportunities, it can ignite ambition, it can engage our faculties in so many ways and enable us to flourish and thrive, because it all comes back to what we believe. But the interesting thing is this whole area of self-sabotage, because our mindsets can also blind us to the opportunities and hinder our ability to learn and grow. And they can keep us tethered to familiar yet unproductive patterns of thought and action. It's really interesting. I just outlined a positive and a negative situation. But if I was to use a quote from Henry Ford, he said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And it is that whole mindset about what we think and what we believe that will drive the things that will take us, if you like, to our belief and what we can achieve.
So part of this is developing that awareness of the thoughts that are going on in our minds, isn't it? And being able to recognize that this is what we believe. So
absolutely. Absolutely. And what I've talked about just a second ago is what's a mindset, right? And we all have them. Quite often our mindsets are so linked into what we grew up with. As an example, if we grew up with parents that always said we had to have a secure job, then our mindset is that for us to be successful, we have to have a secure job. But in today's holistic world, if you like, that's not true any longer. But if it's in our mindset, it can self-sabotage what our capability might be.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one of the things that we were talking about just before, was that an interesting fact was that 40% of our 5-year-olds nowadays are going to have to create their own jobs. And so this is so important, this area of mindset, isn't it, Tony?
Oh, 200%. I think this is one of the things that isn't taught in school is all about mindset. Our educators are quite often focused on the technicalities of the curriculum, and yet for our students to think outside the curriculum is where the growth is. And I know that you and I both know, and our audience will already recognize the truth in that where you make your mistakes is where you have the greatest learning. Yeah. But you have to give yourself permission to make mistakes, and your teachers have to give you permission to make mistakes, and then you grow exponentially. You grow, and again, it's mindset.
That's right. So we're talking about entrepreneurial mindset. What is an entrepreneurial mindset, Tony?
Well, let me just give you a few examples. And the first thing about an entrepreneurial mindset is that it tends to enable the individual to believe in their ability to succeed. And if you have that internal belief, like, I can do this, it will influence your outcomes. But importantly, it's empowering if you want to take ownership of your own life. So the first part of and honestly, there's a lot of studies on this, and I know that if you start doing some research on it, you will find a lot of facts around how your belief will actually direct your outcomes. So believe in the ability to succeed. Another one I think is really quite important is have compelling goals. So if I'm running a race and I know I can run 100 yards, let's say, not me, by the way, but let's just say I could run 100 meters in 15 seconds, then the compelling goal might be to do it in 12. So it's still keeping me motivated. It's keeping me driven, but it's giving me a target. But I have to be, to make that happen, I have to be self-directed. I have to be action oriented, and I have to be engaged in what my compelling goal might be. And so part of that, and we're going to talk about it shortly, is what's my why? And I'll come back to that again. But if you've got a compelling goal, then your entrepreneurial mindset will enable other things to happen. It's a little bit like pieces of the jigsaw that you can't see, but your own attitude and behavior towards those goals actually enables other things to happen. And that might sound a little ethereal at the moment or a little bit out there, but that's the truth of it. Another one which people might say is really obvious, but it's actually hard to do. Have an optimistic interpretation of adverse events. So in other words, if you have a problem, it's got to have potential opportunities. And yet in the whole scheme of things, we start to see the problem as the problem. Let me give you an example of how the world changes. If I was driving a car, and some of you in the audience today may have heard of this analogy, but if I was driving a car, I get given this really massive windscreen so that I can look out forward to see what's going on. And I get a rear vision mirror and a couple of side mirrors so that every now and then I can check in with what's happening behind me. And so if as I'm driving forward, I see a stop sign, then the chances are I'm going to slow down, and then I'm going to think about what I do next, which is wait for the light to turn green and then I can move on. Well, that's the same with any challenges that you have in business. When the potential problems arrive, so do potential opportunities. And I'm sure you will have heard that saying, as one door closes, another one opens. But in that process is where we become more resilient, resourceful, and solution-oriented. And even with highly uncertain, even when our resources might be constrained, our environments might be difficult, actually what happens is that because we are so focused on overcoming the issue by looking at all the different solutions, a solution which will surface, and it could be that we have to take a step back to go forward. And that's part of the entrepreneurial mindset, an optimistic interpretation of what might go wrong, because that silver lining is not necessarily what you see when the problem occurs. And if I was talking about growing up and being driven by our past, then the interesting thing is that we actually need to look back to make sure we're going forward okay. But if we focus on the rear vision mirrors, we will crash. In other words, we shouldn't let anything that we've done in the past impact adversely what's going to be in front of us going forward, because that's our opportunity.
Absolutely. And the other thing I've seen with that, Tony, is that those experiences in the past actually get used in our path going forwards, isn't it? Nothing is ever wasted. We take those lessons.
Totally. So another one would be a lifelong knowledge seeker. And I know I can speak for myself, I never stop learning. I was watching a video the other night, just before I crashed out. And the opportunity that I had to learn from that was, actually it was around some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. And one of the quotes that I'd like to share with you actually came from one of the speakers on that video. I never stop learning, or I've got a book that I've been reading for absolute ages. And Kathy, I'm not sure if you've read The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. But for me, what is the tipping point in business? What are the things that I could do that might enable an extra sale, or enable a product or a service to come to life in a different way? But if I'm not a lifelong knowledge seeker, if I'm not always looking for new knowledge, then I do myself harm. Because I'm missing out on things that I might otherwise learn. And I think my big shout out to the youth that are in the audience is to be a lifelong learner. And it all goes in. I don't know when you might use it. It might be immediately, or it might be in 5 years' time. And for our teachers, I would advocate that if you can encourage the students to be lifelong learners, then you will have been highly successful, because they will always be looking for knowledge. And how does that help? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. From knowledge, you can create micro experience as learning opportunities to test ideas. So an example is that somebody says, oh, if you go into business, you should set up a Facebook business page. Well, that might be true, but my question would be, how do you know? And that's where you can experiment. And there will be many that go into business and go, I've got to have a website. Well, actually, that's true, but it's quite different from Facebook. And so in a heartbeat, I've talked about two marketing opportunities, a website and a Facebook page for business. And yet both of them have different opportunities in different ways, but you still have to test it. And the other thing about being a knowledge seeker is about you cultivate curiosity, creativity, and critical thinking. In other words, you might read something and then you question it and you go, well, that's kind of interesting. I wonder if that's something that I could validly use. Or am I, and what it does is that curiosity opens up the brain in a whole host of different ways. And that's why I'm a bit of a fan of case studies and how does that come to life. But you all the time, you test your ideas, you test your assumptions, and then other things happen as a result of that. Your critical thinking means that your decision making based on the tests that you do are much more valid. I've only got another 3 things to cover in this entrepreneurial mindset. But a really important one is having a high degree of reliability. In other words, if you understand and you follow through on what you see as a simple solution, then actually what people will notice is your actions and your behaviors. And I can't say strongly enough that if people see that you're behaving and acting in integrity and that you're reliable, people will trust you. And one of the things that we talk about in the Pop-Up Business School is that people will buy from people they know, like, and trust. And so earning that trust is just so important.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key thing, isn't it, Tony? Is that this is about character, and it's about developing your character, knowing your values, and being true to yourself, integrity, isn't it?
Oh, 200%. 200%. And if you just say one of my values is that I am trustworthy. Well, there's a whole raft of things that go around being trustworthy. And the other thing I would actually add to that high level of reliability is it can lead to unforeseen opportunity. And let's probably talk about foresight a little bit later in the presentation. But quite often we don't know what we don't know. And we don't know what will happen if we do something. And for me, I absolutely love that piece of the jigsaw. And so let me give you an example. In the Pop-Up Business School, we have around 800 graduates around the country. We're booked out for another 5 events before Easter next year, which will take us over 1,000 graduates. Now, the interesting thing about that is we never know who's going to turn up. And we never know what their business idea is until they're there. What was interesting for me is that I was in Kapiti last weekend, and we never know what's going to happen post the course. They join our graduate or our alumni program, but we never know who's going to do what. Anyway, I was in Kapiti only last weekend, and I turned around and had a look, and I saw Posy Bloom on the window, and I went, oh, Heather's got a shop. And so I went in to say hi, and she said, oh, yes, Kayla and I collaborated and we have leased the store together. And I looked around the corner, and then Kayla's got her beauty salon all set up around the corner. So to get to her beauty salon, they have to go through Heather's Posy Bloom to get to KS Beauty, if you like. Well, we never saw that. They never saw that. It was a collaboration that surfaced at least 2 years after they both did the Pop-Up Business School way back in Kapiti in 2018. And my point around that is that when unforeseen opportunity arrives, you will know because you've done all the homework. You've created reliability in your environment, but you've studied and studied and studied.
So that learning never stops, does it, Tony?
No, man, tell me. I think another thing, there's 2 more. Have a humanistic outlook. In other words, being other focused and understanding that one creates value by looking to solve problems for others. And when you're in business, actually, what is the problem you're trying to solve and how does your solution add value to the other person are really core questions around the business model that you're going to bring to life. And while I won't spend a lot of time on that in this particular presentation, what I want you to think about is it's not all about you. It's actually the last thing is being other focused changes the world. And I guess an example would be our business, and so many other businesses will, even in building the business, create a charity or give donations to a charity that is always ongoing. When we set up the pop-up business school co-working space, we did a collaboration with the Salvation Army in Wellington to give them revenue for an underutilized space. And so I needed a space for our team, but being other focused meant that I saw an opportunity to give a revenue stream where there wasn't one before. And I don't know how many people get helped through that revenue stream, but having a humanistic outlook on how you can improve the lives of others, that's a huge attribute to the entrepreneurial mindset.
Mm.
And finally, sorry, Kathy.
Just jumping in there on that one as well. And in the global networks that I'm involved in, it's almost like your why has to be human focused. You have to have a purpose that is deeper than you, that is deeper than money. And what it does is it gives you a feeling of satisfaction that goes beyond anything, and also creates a reason for people to engage with you in business.
200%. It's interesting. You're going to recognize this last one that I want to talk about in the entrepreneurial mindset. And by the way, for our audience, we are only scratching the surface, but this next one is critically important. So the last one I wanted to talk about was surround yourself with an intentional community. In other words, intentional, they want to positively influence you and they want to critically guide you. Now, I'm not a fan of criticism. I am a fan of constructive comment. And so having a business mentor or a business coach, or in this case, a teacher who can see the potential that you can't see, either in the business idea or in the community or the world that you're going to go into, and are prepared to give you guidance, but also to give you guidance that said, hey, that's not going to work. And so then you have to change the game just slightly. And I think in all of this, and everyone that we've talked about so far, and if I was to go back and just summarize, believe in your ability to succeed, have compelling goals, have an optimistic interpretation of anything that can go wrong, and others look for that silver lining, be a lifelong knowledge seeker, be reliable, have a high level of reliability. People will see that. Have a humanistic outlook by being other focused, and surround yourselves with an intentional community. Now, I just want to close off this section because I know, Kathy, you've got another question, but I want to give you a quote that came from Helen Keller. And for our audience who don't know, Helen was born in the 1880s in America. And by the age of 6, she was blind and she was deaf. And because she was blind and deaf, she could hardly talk. She graduated from university, traveled the world. She's one of the most highly decorated civic earners of awards in America. As she said, life is either a daring adventure or nothing. Now, that's the first part of the quote. And my point around that is you have to be prepared to take risks, go on adventures. And if that's in business, then that's something to seriously consider. And I have lived by that quote for so long. But the second part of the quote is almost as important. She said, security does not exist in nature, nor do the children of men as a whole experience it. Avoiding danger is no longer in the long, so avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. And so my point around this quote is get in there, have an adventure, but go all in. Don't try and keep the back door open. And at the same time, create that entrepreneurial mindset. Kathy.
Go all in. That's fantastic. So there's a couple of things that I want to ask about as well. One is there are a lot of myths about going into business. And I'm just wondering if you could share a couple of those myths that are around.
There's two that we encounter a heck of a lot, actually. One is that you need money, or you need money to make money. You need money for a business. Actually, the truth is that it's never been easier in this day and age to start a business with no money. And there are so many free things or things that you can do. Let me just give you an example. there was one lady that was on the course, and in her garage she had an unused, for a while, running machine. She had just recently decluttered her wardrobe and had a number of clothes that she hadn't worn for a while. And those two things combined, just those two things, clothes and a running machine, gave her almost $1,000 to start doing things around her business. And if I was buying business cards, as an example, I had my brand or whatever that might look like, I could go to Vistaprint and I could get 250 business cards for about $30. And so when I started Pop-Up Business School, that's all I had was 250 cards. And the reason for only getting 250 is I kept changing it. I would tweak it a little bit, I would tweak a little bit, I would tweak a little bit. Now, the business card that I use today has been built on a number of 250 packs of cards. My point is that you don't need money. You just need a little bit and understand that it's all available to you. And we're going to talk about a quote later. Kathy.
And you're picking up a really key thing there, which is one of the things that Roger Hamilton talks about as well, and Richard Branson, is that in business, we learn by doing. So when we start off, just do something, because then you'll tweak it and you'll find out what works and what doesn't work. But there's no point in aiming for perfection before you start. We're not going to get there.
200%.
We learn.
The second one that I wanted to bring up, and by the way, there's a number, but I just really want to talk about these two because they raise their head all the time. You need a full business plan to start a business. If you talk to an accountant or a bookkeeper, quite often they'll say you need a business plan. If you go to the banks, crazy, you need a business plan. Actually, what you need to know more than anything else is your business model. Like, who really is your customer? What is the value proposition that you are going to put in front of them? And who are the suppliers that you're going to have that are going to help you to meet that? Now, I noticed that niche about 3.5 years ago now. And the niche was that over on one side was the banks looking for a business plan. And the entrepreneur would be tail spinning, like, okay, I've got to write a business plan. Where do I start? And then on the other side was something that I already know from my work overseas and in New Zealand and with Victoria University, is actually what you need more than anything else is to understand your business model. So over the last 2 years, I've been creating an app which gamifies the front end of the business plan. And it helps the entrepreneur to know their business model, to know their strengths and weaknesses, to know their financials. And at a certain point, that through that game, the app collects data. And at a certain point, you press a button and, oh my word, magically, all that data migrates to populate a business plan that you then need to tweak to finish and give to the bank. But you are much more stronger. So one of the things that I noticed the niche, and then what am I going to do about it? And so now, 2.5 years later, we have that app up and running, and we're in trial and test mode. But it was actually a myth that you need a business plan, because what you need to know more than anything else is your business model. So Kathy, there's a couple of busting myths. Honestly, I could use up all of our time together talking about myths for sure.
And I would be able to recognize every single one of them as you talked about them.
200%.
If we were to go on from there and go, actually, so what is the truth? We want to set up a business. What's the truth?
Well, it's an interesting one. Maybe if I give a quote from Seneca, who was a Roman philosopher who was rolling around at the time of Christ 2,000 years ago. He said, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Now, the truth, if I just move on to that, if you know your why, then the chances are that you are preparing for something. If that's a business idea, you will be preparing for it. Why do you want to go into business? What's your driver? Have you noticed something? I'll give you an example that I was just at a startup weekend recently, and there was a young team that were trying to create an app to help people that really needed urgent mental health support to access that mental health support, given that post-COVID, they're absolutely maxed out in the mental health sector. And what they were looking at was saying, well, if we had 100 advisors and somebody cancelled a meeting, and let's say that was in Hamilton and you needed support and help in Hamilton, then you could actually go into the app and it would know where there was a vacant space, right? Their driver was to actually help people who had need for support with their mental health. That was their driver. And they were so passionate about it that was they would go to sleep at night thinking about how could they make that business work. And all they'd need to see is on the news that one thing. So if you know your why, then you have a driver, and it's going to be the thing that helps you to see the silver lining where others can't see it.
And that's something that I've seen with lots of people, Tony, is they see that why, and it's like the path opens up for them, doesn't it?
We talked a slide ago around the opportunity that we don't see, and because it hasn't arrived yet. It just hasn't arrived yet. But when you get focused on what your business idea is, then other things, I can't explain it in this presentation as easily, but it's almost like the cogs start to turn and come into play. And an example of that is that for me, critical success factor is know your business model. So I want to refer our audience to the business model canvas. It was designed by Alexander Osterwalder in Switzerland, and you can go into Google Images and search for business model canvas. Honestly, you'll get thousands of them. And if he created that as a Creative Commons license, which means that anyone can download it and they can use that to understand their business model a lot more strongly. Now you can do that on your kitchen table, and we've built our app around how that data is collected and then migrated. But if you know your business model, you will know and be able to test factors of your market segment. You know, if I have a lawnmower business and I'm in Tawa in Wellington in New Zealand, then my lawnmower business, I might only want to have customers that are within a 20-mile radius, because that's a viable model for costs. I'm not having to travel too far, and I'm not having to travel too far back to my home base, whatever that looks like. But then I have to define that market segment. Is that a retired's my customer segment, or young professionals who are time poor? Are they my customer segment? Or are councils my customer segment, because I'm quite happy to mow a park? And so you start to look at your customer segments, and as you do that, you start to see how or what your value proposition is. This is something that doesn't naturally fall out of a business plan. And so that's why I believe that knowing your business model, and honestly, I'm not trying to make it sound tricky. It's not. It's just a matter of actually sitting down and saying, well, who really is my customer? It's a great starting point.
Yeah.
What's their problem, and what am I trying to solve?
That actually takes a huge amount of time, doesn't it, to actually keep going back and thinking about who is my customer, what is the problem I'm trying to solve, and really defining them.
Honestly, it's time well spent. You know, if I was to do just one, there's 9 segments, not customer segments, but there's 9 sections, if you like, to the business model canvas. And we, honestly, at the Pop-Up Business School, we get something in every one of those boxes for our attendees in 2 hours. And then their job after that is to beef that up. Yeah. But it's, for me, it's a critical success factor. So I guess if I was to say something, let's just say, and someone in our audience says, I have a really good idea. Well, how do you test that? Well, actually just grab a business model canvas and see if the pieces of the jigsaw come together. If they don't, you might have to rethink the business model. Does that make sense, Kathy?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And I think that something else that's coming out of there is that this is much quicker to do. We can do it on our own, but it is much quicker to do if we can get people to be able to bounce ideas off and being able to, you know, really explore, will this work, won't this work? Whether it's a business coach, whether it's as part of the Pop-Up Business School, whether it's other people that are also setting up businesses and being able to explore those customer ideas together.
Yeah, 200%. It's there's a business ecosystem out there. It surrounds every business owner in Aotearoa. And yet, quite often, the business owner will think that the ecosystem should come to them. That's not how it works. And if I just quote one, Business Mentors New Zealand, every country has their own business mentor network, is accessible, but the business owner, the entrepreneur, needs to pick up the phone and talk to Business Mentors New Zealand. If I'm in Wellington here, in Aotearoa, then I might go to Wellington NZ, who have business growth advisors, where I could bounce the idea off. A funny thing about Aotearoa, I'm sure it's true in other countries as well, I can invite somebody for a cup of coffee and buy them a cup of coffee and bounce the idea. And my experience so far is that they love being asked to help. Oh, why wouldn't we?
Absolutely. Because that brings back in that human connection that you were talking about before. And the other thing, Tony, is you talked before about the co-working space that you have created, and there are so many co-working spaces around, and I've found that has been a really good place to be able to meet other people and to be able to share those ideas and get excited together.
200%, which leads nicely into a no-brainer. Don't create debt to go into your business. Now, the reason why I say that is because it's the truth, is that if you say, let's just say you take $1,000 out of your bank account to start the business, but you haven't tested the idea, and the idea doesn't work, then you could be $1,000 out of pocket. Imagine if you'd borrowed $1,000 from your parents or your cousin or a friend of the family on the basis that your idea, but you haven't actually done any validation of the idea, then you could end up saying, actually, this idea doesn't work, and now I owe Auntie Mary $1,000, and that's not going to feel comfortable. So don't create debt to start your business. There is always another way. In fact, I'm just trying to remember the name of it, but in Amazon, there's a book about, I think it's something like 300 or 500 ideas, free ideas for your business. There's so many things that you can do now. So I just want to dispel that myth again. Don't go into debt to start your business.
Thank you for that, Tony. We've got another speaker who's talking about finances and budgeting and so on as well. So that feeds really, really nicely into that.
200%. I'll just segue into that for one sec. As an entrepreneur, one of the things that you do have to think about is how much money do you need to succeed? To put on the table so that you can pay your bills. So even if you're living at home and starting a business, actually, the no-brainer is get people around you that can help you with your finances, so that if I need $100 or $200 or $300 a week to go towards my living expenses, will I be getting all of that out of my business? And so that's a litmus test, if you like, about how much money you might need to make in that business.
That's a really good point too. So Tony, then we're talking about entrepreneurs, we're talking about businesses. What's the difference between an entrepreneur and between a business owner?
So a really interesting one for me. The entrepreneur is trying to get the business off the ground, and quite often, in my experience, and I am one of these guys, it's what do I need to do to get it off the ground, and what risks do I need to take? I'm not a huge fan of shortcuts, but sometimes I might just go straight to the person I want to talk to and knock on their door and stay there until they answer the door. When we ran our first event for Pop-Up Business School in Aotearoa, I went to visit the Mayor of Parua. At the time, that was Mike Tana. And I said, listen, I've got a business idea. I really need to bounce it off you, and you can tell me if it's valid or not. And so when I went for that meeting, he had his head of economic development at the time also present in the meeting. I remember at the very end of that meeting, he said, Tony, if you do get this, I hadn't brought the Pop-Up Business School to New Zealand at this point. I was validating, right? I was trying to check to see whether it would actually work. And he said, Tony, if you get this business back to New Zealand, come and see us, because we'd like to be the first one in New Zealand that trials it. And that's exactly what happened. But the difference, so that was the entrepreneur barreling up, banging on the door until it opened, and then keeping a foot in there till I could have a conversation. The the business owner for Paurua, I have to protect that relationship. So we've run 3 events, 2 events in Paurua, and we're now booked for our 3rd in February in Paurua. The only reason we've been asked back is because we've protected the relationship. We've been reliable. And when you're a business owner, there are other things to think about, like what's my compliance? What are the entrepreneur mindset might go on for a couple of years as you transition from being an entrepreneur to a business owner. And I would counsel that the business owner mindset is where you have compliance. It's where you work on your strategies around business, about how you're going to grow the business, how you're going to protect the business. And the entrepreneur mindset is, what do I have to do to get this puppy off the ground? And those 2 different mindsets, you still have to believe. You know, if I was to go all the way back to those very first conversations that we were having, Kathy, and we were talking about the entrepreneurial mindset, you have to believe in your ability to succeed and influence your outcomes. And in that process, you being a business owner, it's also about being a lifelong knowledge learner and about recognizing that you're going to have adverse events, and what are you going to do about that? So hopefully that's just explained the 2 distinct mindsets.
That's fantastic, Tony. And that leads really nicely into the next question, which is that you talk about belief, attitude, and action. And I know you've got a slide to share for that one.
I have. Just before I go to that slide, I just want to share a quote from Helen Keller. And this is very much relates to the truth. And we've been talking about character. And character cannot be, so Helen Keller said, character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experiences of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, vision cleared, ambition inspired, and success achieved. In other words, you have to get out of your comfort zone. And if I talk about, I'm just going to share the slide now, Kathy.
That's really useful as well, Tony, if we think about what's been happening over the last year and the challenges that so many people have faced. If we can turn that positive mindset onto that and go, actually, we can learn through these experiences that we've had, and it's good, even though it's been hard.
Oh, so true, so true. And this slide here is about belief, attitude, and action. And we've talked about belief several times in this presentation so far. What is this conference all about? It's about igniting your leadership and your leadership in business, your beliefs in your own capabilities. There's this beautiful saying, it's a phrase called self-efficacy. And it is about your belief in your capability to achieve something. And so belief always comes first. We talk about self-sabotage in the entrepreneur world quite often. Self-sabotage is when you doubt something, you doubt your belief and the opportunity to achieve something. And then there's almost like flowing through to, so if I believe that, what's the attitude that I'm going to bring to the entrepreneurial game or to the business that I'm trying to create now? On these 3 things, age is not the barrier. It is not the barrier. So if one of our teachers or tutors is listening to this presentation, do they believe that they can make a difference in the lives of their students by bringing their attitude to that belief and then taking action to make that belief real? And so for our students, if you have an idea or a concept or the stuff that you want to learn, do you believe, I mean, deeply, inherently in your soul, believe that there is something that's an idea and you can do something about it? And then what's your attitude? Because I can tell you right now, your attitude, people will notice your attitude. They'll notice if you take action. But if your attitude is laced with being kind, about being in integrity, about having values, then there are a number of other things that will come into play. And so this is a simple slide, belief, attitude, and action. And there are a number of things that I could add to this, like how do you demonstrate where you take action? How do you move from dream into belief? And so my thinking around all of that is that we want people to think about. I'm not, when I say that, I mean everyone. Everyone. If you put your doubts in front of your beliefs, you're putting a huge but on your belief. Oh yeah, I believe that, but there's not enough money. I believe that, but you know, I'm going to have to not spend time with my friends. So therefore, what you're saying is that you don't really believe it enough. So
You've
that
got a really good example of that, haven't you, Tony? Is the guy that the guy that is now selling Lego. Can you tell us
yes,
that story? Because that's a really classic example of this belief, attitude, and action.
yeah. So Adam is 19, and he went off. Was he got himself a job at Countdown, so just part time while he was studying. And interestingly, about 6 or 8 months ago, he came up with a concept in Lego, and he had a friend who had a container, a really big container of Lego pieces that were made up for, I'm guessing, around about 10 to 15 Lego pieces. And so he separated out all the pieces. He made sure he had a model, and then he made up all of them, took photos of them complete with the manual, broke them all down, put them in plastic bags, and then put them up for sale in Trade Me. The interesting thing about that is that he had said to his mates, tell you what, you give me the Lego, whatever I sell it for, I'll give you 50%. And so they were like, oh, okay, it's just sitting in the wardrobe doing nothing. So 50% of something is better than nothing. So they got on board with the concept of the idea. And then after a little while, he noticed that because he was trawling how people were buying and selling Lego, he noticed Lego collectibles. And so then he started acquiring Lego collectibles. I remember he has built all of this with no money, right? So he's just been doing this off his own back. And I remember recently he bought a Lego. I remember his mum saying, why have you spent that much money on that? And he goes, well, over the holidays, I'm going to make it, which will give me some serious enjoyment. And then I'm going to take photos of it, and then I'm going to put it back in the box, and I'm going to resell it. And that's exactly what he did. And then a little while later, he noticed that there were a lot of people in the community, young people specifically, most probably up to the age of about 25 to 30, but starting at 15, 16, would like to have a pair of branded sneakers. And so what he did was he started acquiring sneakers. I think at the moment he's got about 36 pairs of sneakers available. His mother's spare bedroom is actually loaded up with stock. And I remember having a conversation with him and saying, how much money have you got tied up in stock? And he looked at me and went, and I said, you got to know that. How much stock have you got? So, and then another time I said, oh, what's your average margin? Well, what I liked about Adam was that he went away, he created a spreadsheet, put all of what they cost and what he was selling each pair for. So that then about a few weeks later, I asked him, so what's your average margin? He said, hang on a minute, opened up the computer, opened up the spreadsheet, and told me precisely what his margin was. Now,
and this is also a classic example of know your business model, isn't it, Tony? Because his business model is making and selling things on Trade Me.
Yeah.
He knows this market. He knows what he loves, Lego, and he knows that there's a market there for it.
Yeah, it's really interesting for me because he's been going through, in my suggestion, the business model canvas, remembering he's 19, right? Anyway, I spoke to him the other day and he's like, oh yeah, no. And then he showed me what he had done. And I remember looking at him going, well, that's pretty good, because he was isolating his market segments. At the moment, he's positioning his customer around men. But what about, I said, what happens if you suddenly opened up the market to women? Would you be doubling your sales almost in a heartbeat? And it's like, so now he's thinking about how he might make that happen. So this is for me.
That's another thing that with the learning, isn't it? That we try and we learn, and then we can grow on from there. But it's starting, isn't it?
And I'd like to think we talked a little bit earlier, Kathy, about how important it was that you surround yourself with people who are intentional. And so in the meantime, he's brought in a friend of his who's good at graphic design, and he's now got a logo. And he brought another friend in, his brother, I think, who's just bought a high-end camera and now creating really good pictures of shoes so that when he advertises the shoes. And he said, sometimes you get excuse the expression, but sometimes you get a real dog. He said, I bought something that looked really good when I got it. He said, all I did was sell it straight back into the market for the same price that I got it. Yeah. And while it cost me a bit for poke, and that's business, right? That is so business. So I wanted to share that case study with you because it's a really good example of having a belief that you can do something, that you've got a good attitude around it, and you take action. And then you go back around the model again. To close off the section on belief, attitude, and action, Michael Beckworth does this amazing quote: "There's enough for everyone. If you believe it, if you can see it, if you can act from it, it will show up for you." And that's the truth.
Fantastic. Okay, last question then, Tony, is what does leadership in business look like?
Oh man, such a big topic, Kathy, and I've only got like seconds. But let me tell you, there is a case for leadership as you learn your business. Now, why would we say that? Because if you can learn to be a leader rather than a manager as you're growing your business, it will stand you in huge good sense. And I'm just going to share a screen with you, if I can, and this it will just show you the difference between normal traditional leadership and it will and about something I want to touch on really briefly, and that is servant leadership. So you can see from the image that's here, servant leadership is a philosophy, and traditional leadership says that you exercise the power by being the one at the top of the pyramid, and you'll recognize that this is where people are telling you what to do. Whereas a servant leader, they share the power across the team. They put the needs of their employees or their teammates first, and they help develop people and perform as highly as possible. I would love that all teachers everywhere became servant leaders. And I know that's most probably contentious for the audience, but can you imagine that as a tutor, it is not so much about telling the class what to do. It is about engaging them in such a way that they know that they can develop and perform as highly as possible. And so again, it's a mindset. But if you learn leadership rather than management at a really early age, and you use that as a baseline, then other things will fall into place. So leadership is about making others better as a result of your presence and making sure that that impact lasts in your absence. So while I've attributed this quote to the COO of Facebook, I know that that quote has been around for a while. And just kind of, do you want me to carry on with that, Kathy?
Yeah, no, just that if you can show us the next slide, because I think what you've talked about there, Tony, is so true and fits with what so many educators, so many teachers are doing. They do have that passion to be able to grow the people that are in their classes. But it is always an area of growth. And this whole thing is about Ignite Your Leadership. And this is a lifelong journey in terms of growing these skills, growing these attributes.
Totally, and I think there's a number here. So servant leader as a philosophy has been around for a few years now, but it's not traditional. And I really like that it's a highly collaborative leadership model, and that you can add value to others. And then by that I mean you can add value to your customers, you can add value to your suppliers, and a good leader is also going to be somebody who's going to develop other leaders. And I know in our own team, we absolutely follow servant leader as a leadership model. There's this whole thing about having, one of my favorites actually is foresight. In other words, my vision is out there. I've got to take some tactical steps now. My vision is out there. I've got to take some tactical steps now, but my vision is out there. So I've got to make sure that I think long term, knowing that I have to take some steps now, but not losing sight of what my long term will be. There's a couple of important ones. Be results oriented. And results says, this is my outcome. So before I go into meetings often, as a leader, I actually want to be results oriented. In other words, what's my outcome? What's my outcome that I want from this meeting? If my outcome is just another cup of coffee to further the conversation, then that's my outcome. If my outcome is to get to the right person in the audience, in the organization, that's my outcome. My favorite out of all of them, I think, would be listening to understand and not listening to reply. Quite often as human beings, we listen to reply, and we don't really hear what the other person's saying. And I want to counsel one thing at the end of this. New Zealand has one of the highest rates of teen suicides. And it's a sad fact that we have one of the highest rates of cyberbullying and bullying. So anybody that's in this particular conversation today with me and Kathy, I want you to understand the importance of listening to understand the empathy and healing that you can bring to the other person who might desperately just want to have you be quiet and listen. Wasn't what I was actually going to say, but to be quiet and listen.
You're absolutely right, Tony. And we've got quite a few of the other speakers that are talking about this. This left-hand side of this is almost like what we could use as a classroom treaty, isn't it? That this is how we're wanting to be within our class to be able to grow everybody.
Oh, absolutely, 200%. I'm really grateful that I've had the time to spend with you in the Ignite Your Leadership Conference, and I'd like to think that some of the things that we've talked about today just complement what looks like an incredible speaking lineup. And Kathy, all credit to you for bringing this all together. It's being a risk taker that can change the lives of somebody that's watching this that we don't know. And so my hope and my fond wish is that those people that have been with us on the journey today will be able to take at least one thing and use that to create a ripple effect around them to impact the lives of others.
That's what I want to as well, Tony. So thank you very, very much for coming and talking with us today. Really, really appreciate the insight, the knowledge that you bring around supporting other people to be able to set up businesses. So that stuff around the entrepreneurial mindset is so important. So thank you so much.
Grateful. Ciao.